The Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, translated by Chris Van Dyke. Read aloud by Goði Beast. In Heimdallr, Heimir heard the tidings of the death of Sigurd and Brunhild. Aslog, their daughter, and his foster child, was then 3 winters old. He knew that there would be an attempt to destroy the girl at the end of her line. So great was his grief for Brunhild, his fosterling, that he did not care for either his kingdom or his goods. When he realized that he could not keep the girl hidden there, he had a harp made which was so large that he could place the maiden Aslog within it, with many treasures of gold and silver. And then he went abroad throughout the lands, and afterward through the regions of Northlands. His harp was so skillfully made that it could be taken apart and put together at the joints, and on the days when he came beside a waterfall that was nowhere near a farm, he would take the harp apart and bathe the little girl. He had one venlock, which he gave to her to eat. It was the nature of this leek that a man could live long though he had no other food. And when the girl wept, he played the harp, and then she would fall silent, since Heimir was well versed in the Ithlotur that were customary at the time. He had many glorious clothes with her in the harp, and much gold. Then he went from there out until he came to Noreg, when he came to a small farm, which was called Spennerheith, and there lived a poor man named Aki. He had a wife, and she was called Grima. There were no others than themselves. One day the poor man had gone into the woods, and the poor woman was at home. She greeted Heimir and asked what kind of man he might be. He said he was a beggar, and asked the poor woman to give him lodgings. She said that not many came there, so she could easily take him in, and if he thought it was necessary. Then it came about that he had said it seemed to him the greatest comfort would be if a fire would be lit before him, and therefore he was accompanied to the sleeping hall where he might sleep. And then, when the poor woman had kindled a fire, he set the harp beside himself, and the poor woman was not very talkative. Often her eyes were drawn to the harp, since the fringes of one of the glorious dresses struck out of the harp. And when he rubbed his limbs before the fire, she saw one glorious gold ring showing from under his rags, since he was badly clothed. And when he had warmed himself as much as he thought was needed, then he had supper. After that, he told the poor woman to guide him to where he might sleep during the night. The poor woman said it might be better for him to be outside than inside, since my husband and I often talk when he comes home. He told her to make the decision. Then he went out alone with her. He took the harp and kept it with him. The poor woman went out until she came to a barn, and accompanied him into it, and said that he should stay there, and said that he might expect to enjoy his sleep there. And then the poor woman went on to her way and busied herself with her daily tasks, and he himself went to sleep. The poor man came home when evening had fallen, but the poor woman had done little of what she needed to do. And when he was weary when he came home, and difficult to deal with when all was not done which she should have done. The poor man said that there must be a great difference in their happiness when he worked each day more than he could, but she did not get on with those things which needed to be done. "Do not be angry, husband," she said, "because it may be that you might, with a short while's work, ensure that we will be happy for all time." "What is this?" said the poor man. The poor woman answered, "A man came here to our farm, and I think that he has much wealth with him for traveling. He is bowed by old age, but he must have been a great hero, though now he is very weary. I do not think I have seen his equal, but I think he is tired and sleepy." The poor man said, "It seems inadvisable to me to betray one of those who have come here." She answered, "This is why you will for a long time be a little man, for all grows large in your eyes. You must now do one of 2 things. Either you kill him, or I will take him as my husband, and we will drive you away. And I can tell you of how it happened when he spoke to me earlier this evening, and it will seem unpleasant to you. He spoke lustfully with me, and it is my plan to take him as my husband and drive you away or kill you if you will not do what I want." It is said that the poor man had a domineering wife, and she went on until he gave into her goading, took up his axe, and whetted it keenly. And when he was done, his wife led him to where Heimir slept, and was then snoring greatly. Then the poor woman told the poor man that he should make an attack as best he could, and then leap away quickly, since you will not be able to withstand it if he gets his hands on you. She then took the harp and went away with it. Then the poor man went to where Heimir slept. He struck at him and gave him a great wound, but he dropped his axe. He at once leapt away as quickly as he could. Then Hymir woke at the blow, which was his bane. And it is said that so great a din arose in his death throes that the pillars of the house collapsed, and all the house fell down, and a great earthquake occurred, and there his life ended. Then the poor man went to where the poor woman was, and said that he had killed him. But nevertheless, for a while I was not certain how it would go, as this man was terribly powerful. But I expect that he might now be in hell. The poor woman said that he should have thanks for the deed, and it gives me hope that now we will have sufficient money, and we shall see whether what I said was true. Then they lit there a fire, and the poor woman took the harp and wanted to open it up, but I was not able to do it any other way than breaking it, since she had no skill at the craft. And then she went and opened up the harp, and there she saw the girl child, such as she thought she had not seen before, along with much money in the harp. Then the poor man spoke. Now it must happen, as it often does, that it will turn out badly for those who betray one who trusts them. It seems to me that a pendant has come into our hands. The poor woman said, This is not as I expected, but no harm will come about it. And then she asked what the girl's family line might be. But the young girl did not answer, as she had not yet begun to talk. Now it has come about as I expected, that our plan goes badly, says the poor man. We have committed a great crime. How shall we provide for this child? That is clear, said Grima. She shall be called Kraka, after my mother. Then the poor man said, Well, how shall we provide for this child? The poor woman answered, I see a good plan. We shall call her our daughter and raise her up. No one will believe that, said her husband, as this child is much more pleasing than we are. We are both born very ugly, and people will not think it likely that we have a child like this, as uncommonly ugly as we both are. Then the poor woman spoke, You do not know that I have a cunning plan, so this might not seem unlikely. I will shave her head, and rub in tar and other things when it's expected that her hair will come back in. She will then have a hat. She will not be very well clothed. We will all look alike then. It may be that men will believe that I had great beauty when I was young, and then she shall do all the worst work. And the poor man and poor woman thought that she was unable to speak, because she never answered them. Then it came about as the woman had first suggested. She grew up there, and was very poor. And this ends Chapter 1. The Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, Chapter 2. There was an earl called Herod, who was mighty and famous in Gotland. He was married. His daughter was called Thora, and she was the most beautiful woman of all women in appearance, and was most courteous in all things, which were better to have than not to have. It was her nickname that she was called Burgerhort, since she stood out from all women in beauty, as the hart does from all other animals. The earl loved his daughter very much. He had a bower made for her a short ways from the king's hall, and about the bower was a wooden fence. The earl made it his custom to send his daughter something every day for her amusement, and he said that it would go on with this custom. This is said about her, that he had his daughter sent a little heather snake one day, which was excessively beautiful. The snake seemed good to her, and she kept it in an ashen box, and placed gold underneath it. It was there but for a short while before it grew large, as it did the gold under it. It came about that the snake did not have room in the ashen box, and then lay outside of it in a ring about the box. And it afterwards came about that it did not have room in the bower, and the gold grew beneath it precisely as the snake itself did. Then it lay outside around the bower, so that its head and tail could touch each other, and it became hard to deal with. No man dared to come to the bower on account of this snake save one, who brought it food, and it needed an ox as its meal. To the earl this seemed a great harm, and he spoke this vow, that he would give his daughter to that man, whoever he might be, who killed the snake, and that gold which was under him would be her dowry. These tidings became known throughout the land, but nevertheless no one trusted himself to overpower the great snake. And this ends Chapter 2. The Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, Chapter 3. At that time, Sigurd Hring had power over Denmark. He was a powerful king, and was famous from that one war where he battled with Harold Hiddleton at Bravalla, and Harold fell before him, as has become known throughout all the northern regions. Sigurd had one son, who was called Ragnar. He was a large man, fair in appearance and with good intelligence, generous with his men, but stern with his foes. Soon after he had come of age, he got himself troops and warships, and became one of the greatest warriors, so that hardly anyone was his match. He heard what Earl Harold had spoken, but he gave it no heed, and led on as if he didn't know about it. He had made for himself garments in a wondrous fashion. They were shaggy breeches and a fur coat, and when they were done he had them boiled in pitch. Afterwards he kept them stored away. One summer he took his war host to Gotland, and he anchored his ships in a hidden creek, which was a short distance from where the Earl ruled. And when Ragnar had been there one night, he woke early in the morning, rose up and took the same armor which was mentioned before, put on the armor, and took a great spear in his hand, and went off the ship alone. And there, where the sand was, he rolled in the sand. And before he went his way, he took the nail holding the spearhead to the shaft of the spear, and then went from the ship to the Earl's gate, and came there early in the day, so that when he came, all the men were still asleep. Then he turned it towards the bower. And when he came to the wooden fence where the snake was, he attacked it with his spear. He thrust the spear at it, and then he pulled it back to himself, and then he attacked again. That thrust struck the snake's spine, and then he twisted the spear so that the spearhead came off the shaft. There was such a great din at the snake's death throes that all the bower shook. And then Ragnar turned away, and then a jet of blood came and struck him between his shoulders. But that did not harm him, since his clothes that he had made protected him. And those who were in the bower woke with the din and went out of the bower. Then Thora saw a great man going from the bower, and asked him his name and whom he wanted to find. He stopped, and he spoke this first. "I have risked my famous life, beautiful one. 15 winters old, and I vanquished the earthfish. Near misfortune, a swift death for me, save that I have pierced well to the heart the ringed salmon of the heath." And then he went on his way, and did not speak more with her. And the spearhead stood in the wound afterwards, but he had the shaft with him. When she heard this verse, she understood what he had said about her, about his errand, and thus how old he was. And then she wondered to herself who he might be, and she thought she did not know whether he was a human being or not, since it seemed to her that his growth was as large as said about monsters at the age that he was. Then she turned into the bower and went to sleep. And when men came out in the morning, they became aware that the snake was dead, and it was stabbed with a large spear, and the spearhead stood fast in the wound. Then the Earl had the spearhead removed, and it was so large that few could have used it as a weapon. Then the Earl considered what he had said about that man who killed the snake, and he thought he didn't know whether a human being had done this or not. And then he discussed with his friends and daughter how he should search after him. It seemed likely that the man who had won it would afterwards seek to have the reward. She advised him to have a large thing summoned, and command those who do not want to have the Earl's anger and are in any way able to attend the thing to come here. If any is the man who gave the snake its death wound, he shall then have the spear shaft which goes with the spearhead. That seemed promising to the Earl, and he had a thing called. When the day came, when the thing was to take place, the Earl came, and many other chieftains. Many men came. And thus ends Chapter 3. The Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, Chapter 4. It became known at Ragnar's ship that there was a thing to be held shortly. Then Ragnar went from his ship with nearly all his men to the thing. And when they came there, they stood somewhat away from other men, since Ragnar saw that very many more men had come than was customary. Then the Earl stood up and asked for their silence, and spoke. First he asked those men who had responded well to his summons to accept his thanks. Then he spoke of what had occurred, and then he spoke about what he had sworn regarding the man who had killed the snake. Then afterwards he said, "That snake is now dead, and the man who did this famous deed left the spear standing in the wound. And if anyone who has come here to the thing is he who has the shaft which held the spearhead, and which was borne away, and thus may prove his claim, then I shall fulfill what I have sworn, whoever he is, of either great or lowly rank." And when he ended his speech, he had the spearhead brought before each man who was at the thing, and commanded him who had claimed the deed, or who had the spear shaft which fitted the spearhead, to speak. It was so done. None was found to be the one who had the shaft. When the spearhead came to where Ragnar was and was shown to him, then he acknowledged it was hid. Each fitted the other, the spear and the shaft. Then men thought that they knew he must have killed the snake, and he became very famous in all the northern lands on account of this deed. And he then asked for Thora, the earl's daughter, and the earl received this offer gladly. Then she was given to him, and it happened that they had the largest feast with the best provisions in the kingdom. At this feast, Ragnar was married, and when the feast was over, Ragnar went to his kingdom and ruled over it, and he loved Thora greatly. They had 2 sons. The elder was called Adik, the younger was called Agnar. They grew large and were handsome in appearance. They were very strong and were taller than the other men who were around. They knew all kinds of things of Ithorter. It happened one time that Thora fell ill, and she died from this illness. To Ragnar this seemed so grave that he would not rule his kingdom, and gave other men the ruling of his lands along with his sons. And then he took to performing his same deeds as he had before. He set out on a raiding expedition, and wherever he went, he gained victory. And thus ends Chapter 4. The Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, Chapter 5. It was during the summer that he turned his ships to Norway, because he had many kinsmen and friends there, and he wanted to visit them. He came in his ships during the evening into a little harbor. There was a farm a short distance from there, which was called Sprengerheid, and they laid there in the harbor at night. And when morning came, the cooks went to land to bake bread. They saw that a farm that was not far off, and it seemed to them that it would suit them better to go to the house and be there and do their work there. And when they came to this one little farm, they found someone to speak to. It was a poor woman, and they asked whether she was a housewife and what she was called. She said that she was a housewife, and you will not lack my name. I am called Grima, but who are you? They said they were liegemen of Ragnar Loðbrok, and they wanted to carry out their work, and we want that you should work with us. The poor woman answered that her hands were very stiff, but in the past I've been able to do my own work very well, but I have myself a daughter who can work with you and who will come home soon and is called Kraka. But it has now come about that I scarcely have control over her. And Kraka had gone out with the animals in the morning and had seen that many large ships had come to land. And then she went and washed herself, but the poor woman had forbidden her to do that because she did not want the men to see her beauty, because she was the most beautiful of all women. And her hair was so long that it went down to the ground, and as beautiful as the most beautiful silk. And then Kraka came home. The cooks had started a fire, and Kraka saw that men were come there, whom she had not seen before. She looked at them, and they at her, and then they asked Grima, "Is this your daughter we see, this beautiful maiden?" "It is not a lie," said Grima. "That is my daughter you see." "You two must be very unalike," they said, "since you are so monstrous. We've not seen a girl as beautiful, and we see that she in no way has your looks, because you are most hideous." Grima said, "You can't notice it in me now. My appearance is now changed from how it was." Then they agreed that she would work with them, and she asked, "What shall I do?" They said they wanted her to roll out the bread, and they would afterwards bake it. And then she went to work, and she worked well. But they all kept looking at her constantly, so they did not mind their work, and the bread was burned. And after they finished their work, they went back to the ships, and there, when they brought out the meal, everyone said it was that they had never had anything as terrible, as the cooks deserved to be punished for it. Then Ragnar asked why they had done the cooking thus. He said that they had seen a woman so beautiful that they did not mind their work, and they thought that there was no more beautiful woman in the entire world. And when they had said so much of her beauty, then Ragnar spoke, and said that they thought that there could be no one equal to the beauty which Thora had possessed. They said she was no uglier. Then Ragnar spoke, "Now I must send men there, who know how to look well. And if it is thus as you have said, then your heedlessness will be forgiven of you. But if the woman is in any way uglier than you have said, then you shall take great punishment upon yourselves." And then he sent his men to this beautiful woman, but in the headwind was so strong that they could not leave that day. And Ragnar spoke with his messengers, "If this young maiden seems to you as beautiful as been told, tell her to come meet with me, as I want to speak with her. I want her to be mine. I want her to be neither dressed nor undressed, neither fed nor unfed, And moreover, she must not be all alone, but nevertheless no man may accompany her. And the men traveled until they came to the house, and they looked closely at Kraka, and it seemed to them they saw a beautiful woman that they thought they had never before seen one as beautiful. And then they told her the words of their lord Ragnar, and thus how she should be prepared. Kraka thought about it, and how the king had spoken, and how she should prepare herself. But Grima thought it could not be done, and said that she thought such a king would not be wise. Kraka said, he must have spoken thus because it can be done, but if we have the skill to discover what he was thinking. However, I know that I cannot go with you today, but I will come early in the morning to your ship. Then they went away and told Ragnar what had happened, and that she would come to the meeting. And she was at home that night, and in the early morning, Kraka told the poor man that she would go to meet with Ragnar. But I want to alter my dress somewhat. You have a trout net, I want to wrap that around me, and I shall let my hair hang down over it, and I will thus be bare in no place. And I will taste of one leek, that is little food, but it will be known that I have eaten. And when I have your dog accompany me, I will thus not go all alone, even though no man accompanies me. And when the poor woman heard her plan, she thought she had great cunning. And when Kraka had made herself ready, she went on her way, until she came to the ship, and she was fair to see, as her hair was bright like gold. And then Ragnar called to her, and asked who she was, and whom she wanted to. And she answered and spoke this verse. I have not dared to violate your bidding, Ragnar, when you bade me come to your meeting, nor have I broken the king's order. No man is with myself, my flesh is not clearly revealed, I am quite fully a following, but I come all alone. He then sent men to meet her, and had them accompany her to the ship, but she said she did not wish to go unless a promise of peace might be given to her and her companion. Then she was led on to the king's ship, and when she came to the foredeck, he reached towards her, and the dog bit him on the hand. His men leapt at it and struck the dog and tied a bowstring around its neck, and it died from this. No better did those men hold with the promise of peace for her. Then Ragnar set her on the deck near himself and spoke with her, and she answered him well, and he was pleased and happy with her. He spoke this verse. If the precious lady was merciful to the ward of the fatherland, she might take me to stay in her arms. She said, if you will honor our treaty, king, you shall let me go, hence spotless to my home, though the helmsman has pain. And thus ends Chapter 5. The Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, Chapter 6. Then he said that he liked her well, and he thought for certain that she should come with him, but she said it could not be thus. Then he said he wanted her to stay there during the night on the ship. She said that would not happen before he had come home from the journey as he had planned, and it may be that the matter will seem different to you. Then Ragnar called for his treasurer and told him to take that shirt which Thora had owned and which was all embroidered with gold and bring it to him. Then Ragnar offered it to Kraka in this manner. Will you receive this shirt which Thora had made? Marked with silver, this cloth becomes you very well. Her white hands worked this garment. She was dear to the King of Heroes until her death. Kraka spoke in reply, I do not accept this shirt which Thora had made. Marked with silver, wretched cloth is more fitting for me. I am called Kraka, for in soot-black clothes I had driven the goats along the stony paths near the waves. And I will certainly not take this shirt, she said. I will not be arrayed in fine clothes while I am with the poor man. It may be that you would consider me fairer if I were adorned more fairly, but I will now go home. And then you may send men after me, if the matter is the same in your mind, and you want me to go with you. Ragnar said that he would not change his mind, and she went home. And they went as they had intended, as soon as they had wind, and he set about his errand after the fashion he had intended. When he came back, he came to the same harbor as he had before when Kraka had come to him. And that same evening he sent men to find her and speak Ragnar's words, then that she then prepared to depart for good. But she said she could not leave before the morning. Kraka rose up early and went to the bed of the poor woman and man and asked whether they were awake. They said they were awake and asked her what she wanted. She said that she wished to leave and be there no longer. And I know that you killed Hymir, my foster father, and I have no one to reward with more evil than you. But I have been with you a long time, and for this reason I will not let evil be done to you. But I will now declare that each day will be worse for you than the one that came before it. But the last will be the worst of all. And now I will depart." Then she went and proceeded to the ship, and there she was well received. They were given good weather. Then in the same evening, when men prepared their beds, Ragnar said that he wanted Kraka and him to sleep together. She said it could not be thus, as I want you to drink a wedding feast for me when you come to your kingdom, for that seems more fitting to my honor and to you and our offspring, if we have any. He granted her request, and they traveled well. Ragnar then came home to his land, and a glorious feast was prepared for his return. Then there was a joyful drinking for both his return and his wedding. And the first evening, when they came to one bed, Ragnar wished to consummate their marriage. But she asked to avoid that, because she said that in some evil might afterwards be born out of it if her advice was ignored. Ragnar said that cannot be true, and he said that the poor man and woman were not prophetic. He asked how long it should be. Then she said, 3 nights shall pass thus, apart in the evening, although settled together in one hall, before our sacrifice to the holy gods. Thus shall this denial prevent a lasting harm to my son. He whom you are hasty to beget will have no bones. And although she said that, Ragnar gave it no heed, and followed his own advice. And thus ends Chapter 6. The Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, Chapter 7. A little while had passed, and their marriage was good and full of love. Then Kraka knew herself to be pregnant, and it progressed until she gave birth to a boy child. And the boy child was sprinkled with water and given a name and called Ivar. The boy was boneless, and there was cartilage where his bones should have been. But when he was young, he grew so strong that none was his match. He was of all men most handsome in appearance, and so wise that none was known who was a wiser counselor than he. It happened that more children were granted them. Another son they called Bjorn, the third they called Hvitserk, the fourth Rognvald. They were all great men, very valiant, and as soon as they could learn them, they became well versed in all the Ithradir. And wherever they went, Ivar had himself borne on staves, as he could not walk, and he had advice for them in whatever they did. Eirik and Agnar, Ragnar's sons, were such great men themselves that their like could hardly be found. And they went in their warships every summer, and were renowned for their harrying. And then it happened one day that Ivar asked his brothers, Hvitserk and Bjorn, how long might pass by while they sat at home, rather than having their own renown increased. And they said that they would be willing to act upon his advice in that, as it is in other things. Ivar said, "Now, I want us to ask to have ships prepared for us, and troops enough to man them. And then I want us to gain glory and gold for ourselves, if it is possible." And when they had decided upon that plan amongst themselves, they told Ragnar that they wanted him to get them ships and veteran troops who were experienced in the seizings of treasure, and were well prepared for anything. And he gave them to this that they asked, and then, when their troops were prepared, they traveled from that land. And wherever they fought with men, they got the best of them, and got for themselves both many troops and much treasure. And then Ivar said that he wanted them to continue on until a more powerful force was before them, and thus they might test their prowess. And then they asked where he knew to find such a force. And then he named a place, which is called Hvitbear, where pagan sacrifices were held, and many have sought to win it, but none have been victorious. And Ragnar had come there, but had to fall back without having achieved his goal. Are the forces there so great, they asked, and so hardy, that there are no other difficulties? Ivar said both that the thronging troops were great, and the place of sacrifice was powerful, so all that had been gone against it had not been victorious. And then they said that he should advise whether they should set a course for there or not. And he said that he desired greatly to discover what might be the greater, their own hardiness or the magical powers of the people there. And thus ends Chapter 7. The Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, Chapter 8. They set a course for that place, and when they came to that land, they prepared to disembark. And they thought it necessary that some of the troops keep guard over the ships. And Rognvald, their brother, was so young that they thought him to be unready for such great peril as there likely would be. And they had him guard the ships with some of the troops. And after they went from the ships, Ivar said that the garrison had 2 cattle, which were young geldings, and men turned and fled before them, as they could not stand their bellowing and their troll-like form. Then Ivar said, "Bear yourselves as best you can, although you feel some fear, because nothing will harm you." And then they departed with their troops. And when they drew near the fortress, it happened that they who lived in the place became aware of them, and they loosed the cattle that they had great faith in. And when the geldings were let loose, they leapt forward fiercely and roared terribly. Then Ivar saw them from where he was borne upon a shield, and he told his men to bring his bow, and it was done. Then he shot at the evil geldings, so that they both received their deaths. And then the battle that the men had most feared was ended. Then Ragnvald began to speak back at the ships, and he said to the troops that those men were fortunate who should have such entertainment as his brothers had. And there is no other reason that I should remain behind except they wish to have all the glory. But now we shall all go ashore. And then they did so. And when they came upon the troops, Ragnvald went fiercely into the fray, and it happened thus that he fell. And the brothers came to the fortress, and they took to the fray anew. And it happened then that the men of the fortress took to flight, and the brothers pursued the fleeing host. And then we returned afterwards to the fortress. Born spoke this verse: "We fell with a cry upon Grinafith, our swords biting fiercer than theirs, I may truly say. Each who wished to could become a killer of men out before Hvidvar. Let young men spare not their swords." Then when they came back to the fort, they took all the treasure and burned what houses were in the fortress, and broke down all the battlements. And then they sailed their ships thence. And thus ends Chapter 8. The Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, Chapter 9. There was a king called Eystein, who ruled over Svitjof. He was married and had one daughter. She was called Ingebjorg. She was the prettiest of all women, and beautiful to behold. King Eystein was powerful and had many followers. He was ill-tempered, though wise. He had settled himself at Uppsala. He was a great sponsor of sacrifices, and there were so many sacrifices at Uppsala at the time that nowhere in the Northlands were there more. They had great faith in one cow, and they called her Sibylla. She had been sacrificed to so much that men could not stand before her bellowing. The king was wont, when an overwhelming army was expected, to send this cow in front of the host. Such great devilish power filled her that all of his foes became so maddened as soon as they heard her that they fought among themselves and cared not for their own safety. Because of this, Svitjof was unharried by assaults, for men dared not contend against such power. King Eystein had friendship with many men and chieftains, and it is said that at that time there was a great friendship between the kings Eystein and Ragnar. And this was their custom, that they should, alternating each summer, prepare a feast for the other. Then it came about that Ragnar was to go to a feast at King Eystein's, and when he came to Uppsala, there was a good welcome for him and his men. And the king had his daughter fill the cups for himself and Ragnar. And Ragnar's men said amongst themselves that it would not be otherwise than that he would ask for King Eystein's daughter, if only he no longer was married to the poor man's daughter. And then it happened that one of his men brought this to his attention. And thus in the end it happened that the princess was promised to the king, but she would stay as his betrothed for a long time. And then their feast was ended. Ragnar journeyed homeward, and it went well for him, but nothing is said of his journey before he came a short distance from his fortress, and his path lay before a wood. They came to a clearing in the forest. Then Ragnar brought his troops to a halt and asked for their silence, and told all of his men who had been with him on his journey that they should say nothing of his intent to enter into marriage with King Eystein's daughter. Then he laid so strict a penalty on this that whoever spoke of that would receive nothing less than loss of life. And when he had spoken what he wanted, he went home to the town. And then it happened that men rejoiced when he came back, and there was drinking and a joyous banquet in his honor. And then he came to the high seat. He had not been sitting there long when Kraka came into the hall before Ragnar, and sat on his knee and laid her arms about his neck and asked, "What are your tidings?" But he said he knew nothing to tell her. And when the evening came, men took to drinking, and afterwards men went to sleep. And when Ragnar and Kraka came to the same bed, she asked him yet again for tidings, and he said he did not know any. Then she wished to converse more, but he said he was very sleepy and weary from traveling. "Now I can tell you tidings," she said, "if you will not listen or tell them to me." And he asked what they might be. "I call it tidings," she said, "if a woman is promised to a king, although some men say he already has another." "Who told you this?" said Ragnar. "Your men will keep their lives and limbs, since none of these men told this to me," she said. "You remember how 3 birds sat in a tree near you? They told me these tidings. I ask this of you. that you not stay fixed on this course of action as you intended. Now I should tell you that I am the daughter of a king and not a poor man, and my father was such a great man that none have proved themselves as equal, and my mother was the most beautiful of all women and the wisest. Her name shall be lifted up as long as the world is standing." Then he asked who her father was, if she was not the daughter of the poor man who lived in Spengerheith. She said she was the daughter of Sigurd Fafnasbana and Brynhild Buthlastadar. It seems to me very unlikely that their daughter would be called Kraka, and their child might wind up in such poverty as there was at Spengerheith. She answered thus, "This is the story." And then she spoke and brought forth the tale of Sigurd and Brynhild meeting on the mountain, and how she was begotten. And when Brynhild was delivered, a name was given me, and I was called Aslog. And then she spoke of everything that had happened until she met the poor man. Then Ragnar answered, "I am surprised by these mad ramblings about Aslog which you speak." She answered, "You know that I am with child. It will be a male child that I have, and this mark will be on the boy. That it will seem that a snake lies in the boy's eyes. And if this comes about, I ask this, that you do not go to Svigjoth at the time that you would receive the daughter of King Eystein. But if this fails to come about, go if you want. But I want the boy to be called after my father, if in his eyes that mark is glory, as I think there will be." Then it came to the time when she knew herself to be in labor, and she delivered a boy child. Then the serving women took the boy and sprinkled him with water. Then she said that they should bear him to Ragnar and let him see him. And then this was done, and thus the young man was borne unto the hall and laid on the lap of Ragnar's cloak. And when he saw the boy, he was asked what he shall be called. He spoke a verse. "Sigurd will the boy be called. He will thus conduct himself in battle, much like the father of his mother, after whom he was called. Thus will be the greatest of Odin's race be named, the snake-eyed one, and he will bring much death." Then he pulled a ring off his hand and gave it to the boy as a nafnaster. But as he reached forth his hand with the gold, it touched the back of the boy, and Ragnar deemed that to mean that he would hate gold. And then he spoke this verse. "He will be pleasing to heroes, the dear son of Brunhild's daughter, who has gleaming browstones and a most faithful heart. Thus the sword's messenger bears himself better than all Vikings, Buthli's descendant, who quickly disdains the red rings." And again he spoke. "I have never seen bridles in the browstones, or the beard slopes of the brow, save in Sigurd alone. This vigorous beast chaser, thus by this sign is he known." Then Ragnar said they should bear the boy out of the bower, and that was the end of his going to Svithjof. And then the family line of Aslog came out, and every man knew that she was the daughter of Sigurd Fafnasbana and Brynhild Buthlastadottir. And this ends chapter. The Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, Chapter 10. When that time had passed, when it had been agreed that Ragnar would go to the wedding at Uppsala, and he had not come, it seemed to King Eystein that it brought dishonor upon himself and his daughter. And then the friendship between the kings was ended. And when Adik and Agnar, Ragnar's sons, heard that, they then plotted between themselves to go with as many troops as they might muster, that they might harry in Svithjof. And then they gathered together many troops and readied their ships, and it seemed to them very important that all went well when the ships set forth. Then it happened that Agnar's ship shot off the launch rollers, and a man was in the way, and received thus his death. And they called that the reddening of the rollers. This seemed to them not to be a good beginning, but they seemed not to let that stand in the way of the journey. And when the troops were prepared, and they traveled with their troops to Svithjof, there, when they came quickly to King Eystein's kingdom, they traveled across it with war shields. But the men of that land became aware of them, and went to Uppsala, and told King Eystein that they had come to land. And the king had a message sent in the form of an arrow throughout his kingdom, and thus gathered so many men together that it was wondrous. And then he traveled with them until he came to a forest, and there they set up their camp. He then had with him the cow Sibilja, and many were the sacrifices to her before she would travel. And when they were in the forest, King Eystein spoke. "I have news," he said, "that Ragnar's sons are on the field beside this forest. And it was said to me truly that they do not have a third of our troops. Now we shall arrange our host for battle, and a third of our troops shall go meet them first. And when they are so unflinching that they will think to have us in their power, immediately afterwards we shall come at them with all of our might. And the cow shall go before the troops, and it seems to me that they will not hold before her bellowing." And then it was so done. And as soon as the brothers saw King Einstein's troops, and they thought that their foes did not have a power greater than theirs, it did not occur to them that there might be more troops. And soon after, all the troops came from the forest, and the cow was set loose, and she leapt before the troops and went about fiercely. So great a din arose that the warriors who heard it fought among themselves, except for the two brothers holding their ground. But the evil creature struck many a men with their horns that day. But Ragnar's sons, though they were powerful in themselves, thought they might not stand against both the great crowd and the pagan sacrificial magic. However, they faced it unflinchingly and guarded themselves well and bravely and with great renown. They, Eirik and Agnar, were at the front of the host that day, and often they went against the host of King Einstein. But then Agnar fell. Eirik saw this and then bore himself most bodily, and did not care whether it came away or not. And when he was overborne by the great force and seized. And then Einstein declared that the battle should stop, and offered Eirik peace. He said, "I will lay this offer before you, that I will give you my daughter." Eirik replied and spoke this verse: "I will not hear an offer for my brother, nor buy the maid with rings from Einstein, who spoke the words of Agnar's death. My mother will not weep to see me stand, pierced through by a forest of spears. At last I choose to die." And then he said that he wanted men who had followed them to have peace to go wherever they wished. "And I wish to have as many spears as possible taken up, then have the spears set in the ground. And I wish to be lifted up upon them. There I would want to leave this life." Then King Einstein said that that would be done thus. And he asked, though he chose that which went worse with the both of them. Then the spears were set up, and Eirik spoke a verse: "I think that no king's son shall die on so dear a bed, a day meal to ravens, as I know my fate to be. The livid blood ties shall break both brothers' bodies, and soon shriek over us, though that be a bad reward." And then he went to where the spears were set up, and he took a ring off his hand and cast it to those who followed him, and who had been given peace. And he commanded it to Aslog, and spoke verse: "Bear you my last words, you east-faring troops, that the slender maid, Aslog, is to have my rings. Then to the greatest of mothers, my mild stepmother, you may speak of me, her son, and to my glorious spear death." And then he was heaved upon the spears. Then he saw that the ravens flew, and again he spoke: "A sea mew rejoices over the head of my now wounded corpse. The wound hawk craves my unseeing eyes. I think if the raven strikes out my eyes, the wound hawk ill rewards the many times Echo has been given me his ill will." Then he gave up his life with great valor, and his messengers went home and did not let up until they came to where Ragnar had residence. And then Ragnar's sons had not come home from raiding. They were there for 3 nights before they went to meet with Aslog. And when they came before Aslog in her high seat, they greeted her worthily. She received their greeting. She had one linen handkerchief upon her knee, and she had unloosed her hair, and she intended to comb it. Then she asked who they were, since she had not seen them before. He who had spoken on their behalf said they had been among the troops of Eirik and Agnar, the sons of Ragnar. Then she spoke a verse: "What is said by you, friends of the king? What news? Are the Swedes still in their land, or are otherwise driven out? I have heard that the Danes went out from the south, and the chief had bloody rollers. But since then I know nothing." He spoke a verse in reply: "There is no need, woman, that we tell you of Thora's sons are dead. Cruel are the fates to your men. I know no other tale as heavy as this. Now we have come from hearing the news. The eagle flies over the corpse of the dead man." Then she asked how that had happened. And then he spoke the verse which Eirik had spoken when he had sent her the ring. They said that she then let a tear fall, and it had the appearance of blood, but it was hard as a hailstone. No man had seen that she had let fall a tear, either before or after. Then she said that she might not pursue vengeance before they came back home, that is, Ragnar or his sons. "And you shall be here until then. I shall not hold off spurring on vengeance as if they'd been my own sons." Then they stayed there. And so it happened that Ivar and the brothers came home before Ragnar, and they were not home long before Aslog went to find her sons. Sigurd was then 3 winters old. He went with his mother. And then she came into a hall where the brothers were discussing. They received her well. Each asked the other for tidings, and they spoke first of the fall of Rognvald, her son, and of the circumstances, and how it had happened. But that she did not seem grave to her, and she said, "My sons leave me by myself, to gaze over the sea mews. You do not travel from house to house begging. Rongvald took up the shield, red with men's blood. Youngest of all my sons, he came to Odin. And I cannot see, she said, that he could have lived to a great honor. That they asked her what tidings she had. She answered, the fall of Eric and Agnar, your brothers, my stepsons. I think that out of all men, they had the best courage. And it will not be odd if you cannot bear such an injury, but take great vengeance. I will be of great assistance to you in all of this, so that this deed may be more than commonly avenged. Then Ivar said, this is true. I will never come back to Svithjolf eagerly to battle with King Einstein and the pagan sacrificial magic which is there. She pressed him greatly, but Ivar spoke for all of them, and refused outright to make the journey. And then she spoke this verse. You would not be unavenged of your brothers one season later, if you had died first. I would prefer that Eric and Agnar had lived in your stead, though as sons they were not born to me. It is not certain, Ivar said, whether the matter will stand differently, even if you speak one verse after another. However, do you know clearly what strongholds there are before us? I do not know for certain, she said. However, what can you say of the difficulties there might be? Ivar said there had been a great pagan sacrificial magic, and he said that no man has ever heard of its like. And when the king is both powerful and ill-natured, what does he have the most faith in when making sacrifices? He said, that is a great cow, and she is called Sibilja. She is so great in might that as soon as men hear her bellowing, her foes are unable to stand. It is scarcely as if the battle is fought with men at all. It rather seems that they must face the beings of troll-like form before they face their king, and I will risk neither myself or my troops there. She said, one might think you cannot be called a great man and not strive to be one. And when it then seemed to her the matters were beyond hope, she decided to leave, and she thought they did not value her words. Then Sigurd spoke. I tell you, mother, he said, how it seems to me, though I might not affect their answers. I wish to hear it, she said, and then he spoke a verse. If you grieve, mother, the household shall become ready in 3 nights. The road we have is long. King Einstein shall not rule in Uppsala, even if he offers us treasure, if you aid and push us on. And when he had spoken that verse, the brothers rethought their plans somewhat. And then Aslog said, you now declare rightly, my son, that you shall do my will, and yet I cannot see how we might make this to come to pass, even if we do not have your brother's assistance. It may happen, as it seems best to me, that this vengeance of yours will come about, but it seems to me that if you proceed rightly, my son. And then Bjorn spoke a verse. Though little is said in speech, a man may turn over vengeance in his heart, in his hawk-swift chest. We do not have a serpent, nor a snining shake in our eyes, but my brothers gladden me. I will remember your stepsons. And then Hvitserk spoke a verse. Let Agnar's bane now rejoice little, but we must think before we say that there might be vengeance. We must put out a ship into the waves, break up the ice before the stern. We must see which ships have been swiftly prepared. And Hvitserk spoke of this, that the ice must be broken, for the frost was then great, and their ships were in ice. And then Ivar began to speak, and said that it had come to the point when he must take some part in it. And then he spoke a verse. You have both honor and courage in this vengeance, but you might lack this, a strong, obstinate following. You shall bear me before the heroes. I will take the path of vengeance, although I may use neither boneless hand. And now, said Ivar, we must devise the best plans we may for gathering warships and warriors, as we must not spare in this if we are to conquer. And then Aslog went away. And thus ends Chapter 10. Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, Chapter 11. Sigurd had a foster father, and he gathered for him his foster sons, both ships and troops which were well prepared. And then that was done so quickly that the troops which Sigurd was to have prepared were ready when 3 nights had passed. He also had 5 ships, all well prepared. And then, when 5 nights more had passed, Hvitserk and Bjorn had prepared 14 ships. When 7 nights were passed from that time, when they had conceived and declared their voyage, Ivar had 10 ships, and Aslog another 10. Then they all spoke together, and told each other how many troops they had gathered. Then Ivar said that he had sent mounted troops by land. Aslog said, if I had known for certain that troops which went by land might have been useful, I might have sent some troops as well. We shall not delay for that, said Ivar. We shall now go with these troops which we have gathered together. Then Aslog said that she would go with them, for I know best what plans must be taken to bring about vengeance for brothers. "This is certain," said Ivar, "that you will not come in our ships. If you so desire, you may command the troops which go by land." She said it would be thus. Then her name was changed, and she was called Randalin. When the troops both left, but before they did, Ivar told them that where they should meet. Then both parties fared well, and they met as they had decided. And when they had thus come to Svitjoth and the kingdom of King Einstein, they traveled across the land with war shields. Thus they burned all that was before them, killed every man's son, and moreover killed all those who were living. And thus ends chapter 11. The Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, chapter 12. And then it had happened that men escaped and found King Einstein and told him that to his kingdom had come an army which was powerful and thus difficult to deal with, and which would not leave anything unharmed. They had pillaged all they had come across, so that no house was still standing. When King Einstein heard these tidings, he thought he knew who these Vikings might be. And then he had a summons sent by arrow throughout his entire kingdom, and he summoned all those who were his men and who wished to give him troops and might bear shields. "We shall have with us our cow Sibilja, who is a god, and let her leap before the troops. It seems to me that it will go as before, that they will not be able to stand before her bellowing. I will encourage all my troops to do their best, and thus drive off the large and evil force." And then it was thus done, that Sibilja was let loose. And then Ivar saw her charge and heard the hideous bellowing which was coming out of her. He thought that all the troops should make a great noise, both with weapons and war cry, so that they would barely hear the voice of that evil creature when she charged towards them. Ivar spoke with his carriers, telling him that they should bear him forward so they might be closer to the front. "And when you see the cow come at us, cast me at her, and it shall go one way or the other, that I shall lose my life, or she shall have her bane. Now you must take one mighty elm tree and carve it into the shape of a bow, along with arrows." And when the strongbow was brought to him, along with the great arrows they had made, they did not seem to them unsuitable for weapons to anyone. Then Ivar encouraged his men to do their best. Then the troops went with great impetuousness and noise, and Ivar was borne before their battle array. Such a great din arose when Sibilja bellowed that they heard it just as well as if they had been silent and standing still. Then that caused it to happen that the troops fought among themselves, all save the brothers. And when this wonder took place, those who bore Ivar saw that he drew his bow as if he had a weak elm branch, and it seemed as if he drew the arrow point back past his bow. Then they heard a louder twang from his bow than they'd ever heard before, and then they saw that his arrows flew as swift as if he had shot a crossbow, and they saw it happen that the arrows came to sit in each of Sibilja's eyes. And then she fell, but after that she went on head first, and her bellowings were much worse than before. And when she came at them, he commanded them to cast him at her, and he became to them as light as if they were casting a child, because they were not very near the cow when they cast him. And then he came down heavily upon the cow Sibilja, and he became then as heavy as a boulder as he fell on her, and every bone in her was broken, and she received her death. Then he commanded his men to take him up quickly. And then he was taken up, and his voice was ringing so that all heard when he spoke, and it seemed to all the army as if he was standing near each man, though he was far off. It became perfectly silent as he gave his orders, and he spoke to this end, that the warring which they had come for was soon to be all finished, and no harm was done to the troops who skirmished briefly amongst them. Then Ivar encouraged them to wreak great harm upon those they had fought. And now it seems to me that the most violent of them is gone, since the cow is slain. And then both armies had their troops drawn up, and together they clashed in battle. And the battle was so difficult that all the Swedes said they'd never had such a trial of their manhood. And then both brothers, Svitserk and Bjorn, went at them so hard that no battle array could stand against them. And then so many of King Einstein's troops fell that a scant few remained standing, and some decided to flee. And the battle concluded thus, that King Einstein fell, and the brothers had the victory. And then they gave quarter to those that lived after the battle. And then Ivar said he did not wish to harry in the land, because that land was now lacking a leader. And I would that we could hold course until a greater opposition is before us. But Randalin journeyed home with some troops. And thus ends chapter 12. Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, chapter 13. Then they decided among themselves that they should harry in the southern kingdom, And Sigurd Ormur Aga, Randalin's son, went with his brothers on every raid after that. In these raids they strove against every town which was strong, and they fought so that none could prevail against them. And then they heard that there was one town that was both strong and full of hardy men. And then Ivar said that he wanted to head for there. And this is said of what that town was called and who ruled over it. The chieftain was called Vifil, and his namesake was a town called Vifilsburg. Then they traveled with war shields so that they desolated all the towns that they happened upon, until they came to Vifilsburg. The chief was not at home in his town, and many of his troops were away with him. Then they set up their tents on the plains that were about the town. They were peaceful during the day when they came to the town, and they held a talk with the townsmen. Ragnar's son asked the townsmen whether they would rather give up the town, and in return they would all be granted peace, or rather test their forces and their hardihood, and their men would receive no quarter. But they responded quickly and said that the town would never be so overcome. But before that happens, you must try us and show us your valor and zeal. Then the night passed, and the very next day they went to strive against the town, but could not overcome it. They sat around the town for half a moon, and they strove every day with different strategies that they might get the town. But it happened that they were no nearer victory after a long while, and then they decided to turn away from there. And when the townsmen became aware that they were planning to turn away from there, then they went out into the town walls and spread out their valuable cloth and all those clothes, which were the finest in town, over the town walls, and they laid out their gold and their valuables, which were the most expensive in town. And then one of their troop took up the words and spoke. We thought that these men, the sons of Ragnar, and their troops were hardy men, but we can see that they have not come nearer to victory than others. Then after they shouted at them and beat upon their shields and egged them on as best they could. And when Ivar heard that, he was so greatly startled that he fell into a great sickness, so that he might not stir, and they had to wait until it came about that he recovered or he died. He laid there all day that evening, and spoke not a word. And then he spoke with those men who were with him, saying they should tell Bjorn, Hvitserk, and Sigurd, and all the wise men, that he wanted to hold a talk with them. And when they all came and were in one place, those who were the greatest leaders among the troops, then Ivar asked if they had devised any tactic which would likely to succeed more than those which they had tried before. And then they all answered that they did not have such wit in these matters, so that they might devise a tactic that would be successful. Now, as often, you're the one whose advice would be useful, they said. Ivar answered thus, One plan has come to me in my mind, which we have not tried. There is a large forest not far from here, and now, when night falls, we shall travel from our tents secretly to the forest. But we will leave our war tent standing here, and we come to the forest, each man shall bind branches for himself. And when that is done, we shall attack the town from all sides, and strike fire in the wood, and there will be a great blaze, and the town walls will then lose their lime because of the fire. And we shall then bring up our war slings and see how hardy they are. And thus it was done. They traveled to the forest, and they were there as long as Ivar deemed necessary. Then they attacked the town in accordance with his arrangements, and when they had struck fire in the large pile of wood, there was so great a blaze that the walls could not stand it, and they lost their lime. Then Ivar's troops brought their war slings up to the town and broke a large gap in the walls, and a battle began. And as soon as the two forces stood openly opposed in battle, then the troops of the townsmen fell. And some fled before them, and some, in the end, fled to their ships. They killed every man's child who was in the town, and they took all the goods and burnt the town before they went on their way. And thus ends chapter 13. The Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, chapter 14. Now they held course from there until they came to the town called Luna. By then they had broken nearly every town and every castle in all the southern kingdom. And they were then so famous in all that region that there was no child, however young, that did not know their name. Then they planned not to let up until they had come to Romaburg, because that town was then both very mighty and full of men, and famous and rich. But they did not quite know how long a distance it was to that town, and they had such a large troop they could not supply provisions for them. And when they were at the town of Luna, they discussed the journey amongst themselves. Then there came a man who was old and cunning. They asked what sort of man he was, and he said he was a poor beggar and had, for all his life, journeyed across the land. You must then know many things you can tell us, which we want to know. The old man answered, I do not know of anything that I will be unable to tell you, whatever land you want to ask of. We want you to tell us how far it is to Romaburg from here. He answered, I can show you something to indicate that. You may see here these ancient iron shoes which I have on my feet, and these others which I carry on my back, which are now worn out. But when I set out from there, I bound these worn-out shoes, one on my feet. And when I now have them on my back, and at the time both sets were new. I have been on the road ever since. And when the old man said that, they thought they could not continue on the way to Rome as they intended among themselves. And then they turned away with their warriors and captured many towns which had never been captured before, and proof of this can be seen to this day. And thus ends chapter 14. Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, chapter 15. Now the story tells us that Ragnar was sitting at home in his kingdom, and he did not know where his 2 sons were, or Randalin, his wife. But he heard tales from all his men that said that none might be equal to his sons, and it seemed to him that none were as famous as they. Then he wondered how he might gain fame that would not be any less long-lived. Then he thought about this to himself, and he sent for his craftsmen and told them to fell wood for 2 large ships. And men heard that these 2 merchant vessels were so large that such ships had never been made in the Northlands. Then he gathered from all his kingdom a large mass of arms. And from these actions, men discerned that he decided to go on a war campaign away from his land. This became known across all the lands that were nearby. And then all the men and kings who ruled those lands feared that they might not be able to remain in their lands. And they all had watchers set up across their lands in case he might attack them. One day Randalin asked Ragnar where he was intending on journeying. He told her that he intended to go to England, with no more ships than 2 merchant vessels, and as many troops as they might ferry. Then Randalin said, This journey which you are planning seems very imprudent to me. I have a mind to advise you to have more boats and smaller ones. There is no glory, he said, if men conquer a land with many ships. But there is no tale of any that have conquered such a land as England with only 2 ships. And if I suffer defeat, it is better that I have taken few ships from this land. Then Randalin answered, It seems to me no less expensive to build these 2 ships than to have more long ships for this journey. And if you know that it is difficult for ships to hold course to England, and if it happens that your ships are lost, then even if your men make it to land, they will then be lost if the lord of the land comes. It is better to hold course to harbors and longships than in merchant vessels. Then Ragnar spoke this verse. No bold man may spare the amber of the Rhine if he desires warriors. But many rings help a wise chieftain worse than warrior men. It is bad to defend the town gates with brand-red rings. I know very many dead boars whose treasures live on. And then he had the ships readied and his men gathered, so that the merchant vessels were fully loaded. There is much discussion about his plans, but he spoke this one verse. What is it that I, the breaker of rings, hear roaring from the rocks, that the distributor of the fire of the hand should abandon the difficult serpents of the sea? I, the scatterer of the forearm layings, shall, Lady Bill, follow my plan unwavering if the gods are willing. And when his ships and those troops that would accompany him were ready, and when it seemed as if the good weather would come, Ragnar said that he would go to the ships. And when he was ready, Randalin accompanied him to the ships. But before they parted, she said that she would reward him for that shirt which he had given her. He asked what manner of reward it would be, and she spoke a verse. I sewed for you a shirt with no seams. With hale heart I wove it out of the greyed woolen hair. Wounds will not bleed, nor will edges bite, through this invincible shroud which is blessed by the gods. He said that he would accept this aid. And then when they parted, it was evident that their parting seemed very difficult for her. Then Ragnar held course in his ships to England, as he had planned. He received a bitter wind, so that he broke both his merchant vessels against England. But all his troops came to land, and they kept them their clothes and weapons. And there, whenever he came to farms of towns and castles, he conquered them. And there was a king called Ella, who then ruled England. He had heard reports when Ragnar had left his own land. Ella had sent forth men so that he might know as soon as Ragnar came to land. Then these men journeyed to meet with King Ella, and told him war tidings. Then he had a summons sent throughout all his lands, and commanded every man come to him who could wield a shield and ride a horse, and who dared to fight. He gathered so many together there that it was a wondrous thing. Then King Ella and his men prepared for battle. King Ella spoke with his troops. If we gain victory in this battle, and it happens that you know that it is Ragnar who has come against us, then you shall not bear weapons against him, because he has sons who would never again leave us if he fell. At the same time, Ragnar prepared for battle, and he had that piece of clothing which Randalin had given him at their parting on over his mail. And in his hand was that spear with which he had vanquished the snake which lay about Thor's bower, and which no one else had dared to face. And he had no protection save his helm. And when they met, the battle began. Ragnar had fewer troops. The battle had not been going long before most of Ragnar's troops had fallen. But wherever he went that day, the army cleared way before him. He struck at their shields or mail or helms, and so great were his hewings that none could stand before them. It happened with all who shot or hewed at him that not one weapon did him any harm, and he never received a wound, but he killed a great multitude of King Ella's troops. However, the battle ended so that all of Ragnar's troops fell, and he was overborne with sadness. Then he was asked who he was, but he was silent and did not answer. Then King Ella spoke. This man may thus come to a greater trial if he will not tell us who he is. Now he shall be cast into a snake pit, and let him sit there for a very long while. But if he says anything by which we might know he is Ragnar, then he shall be taken out as quickly as possible. Then he was led from there, and he sat in the pit a very long while, but no snakes fastened onto him. Then the men said, This man is very strong. He was not bitten by a weapon all day, and now no snakes harm him. Then King Ella said that he was to be stripped of the outermost clothing that he had on. Thus it was done, and all the snakes hung on him on all sides. Then Ragnar said, The young pigs will now squeal if they knew what the older ones suffered. And thus he spoke thus. They did not know for certain that it was Ragnar who was held rather than another king. Then he spoke a verse. I have had 51 battles which were thought glorious. I made much harm. I did not look to a snake to be my bane. Things happen very often to one that one thinks of the least. And then he spoke another. The young pigs will squeal if they know the state of the boar, of the injury done to me. Snakes dig in my flesh, stab at me harshly, and have sucked on me. Soon now will my body die among the beasts. Then he gave up his life, and he was taken out of there. And King Ella thought he knew that it was Ragnar who had given up his life. Then he thought to himself how he could come to know this, and how he could hold his kingdom, and how he could know in a way that Ragnar's sons would react when they learned of it. He decided on a plan. He then readied a ship, and chose a man to carry out that plan, who was both wise and hardy. Then he chose men, so that the ship was well manned, and said that he wanted to send a message to Ivar and the others to tell them of the fall of their father. But the journey seemed hopeless, so that few wanted to go. And then the king spoke, And you must attend closely to how each of the brothers reacts to the tidings. Then travel away afterwards when you are given fair winds. So he had the journey prepared so that they wanted nothing. And then they journeyed, and they traveled well. And the sons of Ragnar had been out harrying in the southern kingdom. Then they turned their course to the northlands and planned to visit their kingdom where Ragnar ruled. But they did not know of this battle journey or how it had turned out, but they were curious to know how it had turned out. Then they journeyed across the south to the land, and everywhere when men heard of the journey of the brothers, men deserted their towns and carried their belongings off and fled away before them, so that the brothers could scarcely find food for their troops. One morning, Bjornside woke and spoke a verse. The falcon flies here each morning over these hardy towns. With a lack of luck, he might die of hunger. He should fare south over the sand, where we let the dew from great blows flow from wounds, and there where in the flowing of men's deaths. And he spoke another. It was first that we journeyed to begin to hold phrase play in Romaveldi, and where we had scant few troops. There I let my sword be drawn for the murder and manslaughter of those greybeards. The eagle shrieks over the fallen slain. And thus ends chapter 15. Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, chapter 16. They went on so that they came to Denmark before the messengers of King Ella, and then they sat quietly with their troops. And when the messengers came with their troops to the town where their sons of Ragnar were being given a feast, they went into the hall where they were drinking, and went before the high seat where Ivar was lying. Sigurd Ormur and Hvitserk sat playing Hinnertafel, and Bjorn Jarnsteder was carving a spear shaft on the floor of the hall. And when the messengers of King Ella came before Ivar, they spoke with him respectfully. He received their greeting, and asked where they were from, and what tidings they bore. And the one, who was their leader, said that they were Englishmen, and that King Ella had sent them thither with tidings which spoke the fall of Ragnar, their father. Hvitserk and Sigurd quickly let the tafelpieces fall from their hands, and they attended closely to the tide-telling. Bjorn sat on the floor of the hall and leaned on his spear shaft, but Ivar asked him exactly what the circumstances of Ragnar's life-leaving had been. And they told it all as it had happened, from the time he came to England until the time he gave up his life. And then when the tale came to when he had said the young boars might grumble, Bjorn squeezed the spear shaft with his hand, and he squeezed so strongly that the print of his hand was seen on it afterwards. When the messengers ended the recounting, Bjorn shook the spear asunder so that it broke into 2 pieces, and Hvitserk held a tafelpiece that he had been moving, and he crushed it so strongly that blood spurted out from under each fingernail. And Sigurd had been holding a knife and paring his nails when the tidings were being told, and he listened so closely to the tidings that he did not notice until the knife stood in the bone, and he did not flinch at that. But Ivar asked how it all happened, and his color was now red, now livid, and he would suddenly become very pale, and he was so swollen that his flesh was all mortified from the anger that was in his breast. Then Hvitserk began to speak, and said that vengeance could be most quickly taken by killing the messengers of King Ella. Ivar said, "That shall not be. They shall go in peace wherever they wish, and anything which they lack, they need only to ask me for, and I shall secure it for them." And when they ended their errand, they turned back out of the hall into their ships. And when they were given wind, they put out to sea, and they traveled well until they came to a meeting with King Ella, and they told him how each of the brothers had reacted to the tide signs. And when King Ella heard of that, he spoke, "It is certain that we will need fear either Ivar or else no one, because of what you say of him. Thoughts of revenge do not run very deep in him, and we will manage our kingdom against them." And then he had watchmen sent out throughout his kingdom, so that no army might come to him unknown. And when the messengers of King Ella had gone away, the brothers began to discuss how they should go about revenging Ragnar, their father. Then Ivar spoke, "I will have no part in this. I shall not muster troops, for it happened with Ragnar as I had thought it would. He prepared badly for his action from the beginning. He had no grievance with King Ella, and it often happens that if a man stubbornly decides to act unjustly, he is brought down contemptibly in such a way. And I will accept compensation from King Ella if he will give it to me." But when the brothers heard that, they became very angry and said they would never become so cowardly, although he wished it to be. Many might say we will wrongly rest our hands upon our knees if we do not seek father vengeance, when before we have fared widely across the land with war shields and killed many a guiltless man. But it shall not be so. Rather, every ship in Denmark that is seaworthy shall be readied. The most skilled troops shall be gathered, so that every man who may bear a shield against King Ella shall travel with us. But Ivar said that he would leave behind all the ships that he commanded, except for that one which I will be on myself. And when it was heard that Ivar would not take any part in the action, they received many fewer troops, but they went nonetheless. And when they came to England, King Ella became aware of it, and quickly had his trumpet sounded, and called to him all the men who wished to assist. And then he went with so many troops that no one could say how many had come, and he went to meet the brothers. Then the armies met with each other, and Ivar was not there when they clashed in battle. And when the battle ended, it came about that the sons of Ragnar fled, and King Ella had the victory. And while the king was pursuing the fleeing host, Ivar told his brothers that he did not intend to turn back to his land. And I desire to find out whether King Ella will do me any honor or not. It seems to me better to thus receive compensation from him than to fare often again as we have now fared. Hvitserk said that he would not have dealings with him, and he would go about his affairs as he wished. But we shall never take payment for our father. Ivar said that he would part with him, and told them to rule the kingdom that they had all held together. and you should send me my things when I ask for them." And when he had spoken, he bade them farewell. Then he turned again to meet with King Ella, and when he came before him, he greeted the king worthily, and spoke to him thus: "I have come to meet with you, and I want to come to an agreement with you on such compensation as you will prepare for me. And now I see that I have nothing compared to you, and it seems to me better to accept such compensation from you as you will grant me, rather than lose my men or myself to you." Then King Ella answered, "Some men claim that it is not safe to trust you, and that you speak most fairly when you are thinking deceitfully. It would be difficult to defend against you and your brothers. I will ask little of you. If you will grant it, I will swear to you in this manner, that I shall never be against you." Then the king asked him to say what compensation he wanted. Ivar replied, "I want you to give me as much of your land as an ox hide covers, and outside of that shall be the outer boundary. I will not ask more of this than you, and I think that you wish me little honor, if you will not grant me this." "I do not know," said the king, "whether it might harm us if you have that much of my land, but I think I will give it to you, if you will swear not to bear arms against me. If you are true to me, I shall not fear your brothers." And thus ends chapter 16. The Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, chapter 17. Then they discussed the matter between the two of them, and Ivar swore him an oath that he would not strike against him and not conspire to cause him harm, and he should have as much of England as an ox hide could cover, the largest he might find. Then Ivar took a hide from an old bull, and he had it softened, and then he had it stretched 3 times. Then he cut all asunder into strips as narrowly as possible, and then he let them be split in half between the hair and the flesh. And when this was done, the thong was so long that it was marveled at, as it had not been thought that it might become so large. And then he had it laid around a field, and there was as much space as within a large town, and there he had the foundation marked for the large town wall. And then he had gathered to him many craftsmen, and had many houses raised on that field, and there he had a large town built, and it was called Lundunaburg. It is the largest, most famous of all towns in northern lands. And when he had this town made, he had his movable property sent over, and he was so liberal that he gave with 2 hands, and people thought so much of his wisdom that all sought him to assist their counsels in difficult cases. He so arranged all the cases so that each party thought he got the best of it, and he became so popular so that he had many friends about him. The king took much advice from him, and he arranged the cases so that they did not come before the king. When Ivar had proceeded with his plan until it seemed that peace was guaranteed him, he sent men to find his brothers and tell them that they should send him as much gold and silver as he asked for. And when these men came to find the brothers, they told their errand, and also that they had come of Ivar's plan, namely, that men thought they did not know what was cunning he was preparing. And therefore the brothers thought that he did not have the same position as he was wont to have. Then they sent such goods as he had asked for, and when the goods came to Ivar, he gave all the goods to the strongest men in the land, and stole the troops out from under King Ella. They all said that they would sit quiet, though he might later prepare for a war going. And when Ivar had thus stolen the troops from out under the king, then he sent men to find his brothers, and to say to them that they wanted them to send a levy throughout the lands which their rule stretched over, and they should demand however many men they could get. And when his word sending came to the brothers, they quickly figured out that he most likely thought it was very promising that they might now gain victory. Then they summoned troops from all Denmark and Gotland and all the kingdoms which they had power over, and an innumerable amount was gathered together when the assemblage was complete. They then held course in their ships towards England both night and day, for they wanted to let as little forewarning of their coming to travel before them as possible. Then war tidings were told to King Ella. He summoned his troops, but he gathered few men, because Ivar had stolen many troops out from under him. Then Ivar went and met with King Ella, and said that he wished to carry on that which he had sworn. But I cannot influence my brothers' doings. However, I can plan to find them, and know if they will stop their army, and do no more ill than they have already done. Then Ivar went to meet his brothers, and encouraged them greatly to go forth as best they could, and let a battle come about as soon as possible, because the king has very few troops. And they answered that he did not need to encourage them, as their intent was the same as before. Then Ivar went and met King Ella, and told him they were too eager and enraged to listen to his words. And when I wanted to bring peace between you, they shouted against it, Now I will carry through on my vow that I will not war against you. I will be quiet along with my troops, and the battle with you may go as it will." Then King Ela saw the troops of the brothers, and they came so fiercely that it was wondrous. Then Ivar spoke, "Now is the time that you should prepare your troops, King Ela, and I think that they will press against you with a strong onslaught for a while." And as soon as the troops met each other, there was a great battle. And the sons of Ragnar came hard upon the army of King Ela. Their vehemence was so great that their only thoughts were how they might work the most damage, and the war was both long and hard. And the battle ended thus. King Ela and his troops took to flight, but he was seized. Ivar was in nearby, and he said that they should now bring about his life leaving. "Now is the time," he said, "to remember the manner of death which he inflicted on our father. Now a man who is most skilled in wood carving shall mark an eagle on his back so precisely that the eagle shall redden with his blood." And that man, when he was called to this task, did as Ivar commanded him, and King Ela was in great agony before the task was ended. Then he gave up his life, and it seemed to them that they then had vengeance for their father, Ragnar. Ivar said that he wanted to give them the kingdom that they all held together, and he wished to rule over all of England. And thus ends chapter 17. Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, chapter 18. After that, Hvitserk and Bjorn journeyed home to their kingdom along with Sigurd, but Ivar stayed behind and ruled England. From then on, they kept their troops together less, and harried in various lands. And Randalin, their mother, became an old woman, and Hvitserk, her son, had gone raiding on his own in the eastern ways, but great powers came to meet him, that he could not raise his shield against, and he was seized. He then chose his manner of death, that a pyre should be made of the heads of men, and there he would burn and thus give up his life. And when Randalin heard that, she spoke a verse. "One son which I had endured death in eastern ways. He was called Hvitserk, who was never eager to flee. He was heated on heads, hewn from those chosen at battle. Brave prince chose that death before he fell." Then she spoke another. "A tree of the people had himself destroyed, with countless heads under the king, fires of fire sang out his fate. What better bed should a battle striker lay himself upon? The high all-ruling chieftain chose to fall with renown. A great family line has come from Sigurd Ormur. His daughter was called Ragnhild, the mother of Harald Hroðfafnir, first to rule over all of Noreg alone. And Ivar ruled over England until his dying day, when he became deathly sick. And when he lay with that killing illness, he said that he should be moved to a place which was most exposed to raiding, and he said that he expected that any who would land there would not gain victory. And when he breathed his last, it was done, and he had said, and then he was laid in a howe. And many men say that King Harald Sigurdsson arrived in England. He arrived where Ivar was, and he fell on that expedition. And when Vilhelm Bastard came to land, he went to and broke open Ivar's howe, and saw Ivar unrotten. Then he had a great fire made, and had Ivar burned in the fire, and after that he battled across the land and had victory. And from Bjorn Jarnseid had come many men. From him has come a great family. Thorth, who farmed at Hofta in Hroftastrom, was a great leader at the things. And then when the sons of Ragnar had all given up their lives, their troops who assisted them were dispersed far and wide, and all of them who had been with the sons of Ragnar thought there was no worth in other princes. There were 2 men who traveled widely across the land to discover if they could find any prince with whom they thought it would not be disgraceful for them to serve, but they did not travel together. And thus ends chapter 18. The Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, chapter 19. It came to pass that in this one land a certain king had 2 sons. He took sick and breathed his last, and his sons wished to drink a funeral feast for him. They decreed that all men could come there to the feast that had heard of it in the next 3 winters. Now this was heard widely throughout the land, and in these 3 winters they prepared the feast. And when the summer came, when they would drink the funeral feast, and the time which was appointed arrived, the feast turned out to be so very filled with men that none knew of its precedence, it was so large. And a great many halls were prepared, and many tents set up outside. And when the first evening was far on its way, a man came into the hall. This man was large, that none were as large, and from his attire it could be seen that he had been with noble men. And when he came into the hall, he went before the brothers and spoke to them, and asked where they would direct him to sit. He pleased them well, and they told him to sit on the upper bench. He needed the space of 2 men. As soon as he sat down, drink was brought to him as to other men, but there was not a horn so large that he might not drink of it in one drink. And all thought that they could discern that they were all as nothing compared to him. Then it happened that another man came to the feast. He was rather larger than the one before. Both men had low-hanging hoods. And with this man came before the high seat of the young kings. He spoke handsomely and asked them to direct him to a seat. They said that this man should sit farther in than on the other on the bench. Now he went to his seat, and together they took up so much room that 5 men had to rise up for them. And he who came first was a smaller drinker. And the second one drank so quickly that he poured nearly every horn into himself, and men did not find that he became drunk. And it seemed he held his seatmates in contempt, and he turned his back on them. He who came first said that they should have a game together. And I will go first. He shoved the other with his hand and spoke a verse. Speak of your great achievements. Educate us, I ask you. Have you seen the raven shudder on the branch, bloated with blood? Have you more often been otherwise, found in the high seat, rather than gathering bloody carrion for the birds of war in the dale? Now it seemed to him who sat on the outside that he was challenged by such a direct verse, and he spoke a verse in reply. Be silent at once, you called a stay at home. You are content with very little. You have never done what I may boast of. You have not fattened the sun-seeking bitch with the drink of sword's play, but gave up the harbor horses. What is troubling you? Now he who came first answered, We let the strong cheek of the horses of the sea run to the waves, the sides of our bright mail splattered with blood. Then she will feasted, the hunger of the eagles was sated on the blood from men's reddened necks, while we seized the hard meal of the fish's land. Now he who came second spoke. Very little I saw of you when the swift-wading horses found the brewing white plain before them, and with weak courage you hid from the ravens near the mast, when we turned our red prows against the land. And then the one who came first spoke. It does us no honor to quarrel about what we have done greater than the other over ale in the high seat. You stood upon that sword stag as waves bore it through the sound, and I sat in the berth as the red prow rode in the harbor. Now he who came second answered, We were both companions of Bjorn at the sword den. We were proven warriors when we strove for Ragnar. I bear the wound in my side from the heroes' beaks in the land of the Bulgars. Neighbor, sit farther in beside me. And in the end, they knew each other and were together there at the feast. And thus ends chapter 19. The Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok, chapter 20. There was a man named Ogmund, who was called Ogmund in Danski. He journeyed one day along with 5 ships, and lay anchor at Samsey in Munorvag. Then it is said that the cooks went to land to prepare the meat, and other men went into the woods to entertain themselves. There they found an ancient tree man, and it was 40 feet in height and covered with moss, but they could still make out all of him, and they discussed amongst themselves who might have sacrificed to this great god. And then the tree man spoke. It was long ago when the offspring of the Sea King journeyed on the way here in the tongues of landlings across the bright salty trail. Since then I have been responsible for guarding this place. And thus the warriors, sons of Loðbrok, set me thus, near the southern salt sea. In the southern parts of Samsey they sacrificed to me, prayed for the deaths of men. They bade the man stand near the thorn bush, covered in moss, as long as a strand endured. Clouds weep upon each of my cheeks, for now neither flesh nor clothing shelters me. And that seemed wondrous to them, and afterwards they spoke of it to other men. And thus ends chapter 20, and the close of the Saga of Ragnar Loðbrok. Thank you for joining us.